Okay, time for the second reading, the second extract. Again, same goals. We're here to gain a in-depth understanding of Hume through reading his writing. We need to look at words we don't know. We need to clarify them. We need to make sure too that expressions and the way things are worded are also made really clear. One thing for me is that when I tend to hear someone read, I find it much easier to understand, especially if it's in a language which I'm not that familiar with. Actually, when I say that, I don't mean a language, but written in like an old-fashioned prose is probably a better way to say it. So hopefully, I know from my point of view, actually hearing someone read to me, then explaining what it means, would be a much better way for me to understand something than just being forced to read it by myself. We know, look, it's pretty clear that when we go back to the summary, what we're looking at is actually covered in, really clearly understood in the text. So if you've gone through and you've read the summary, and not read it, but you've watched the summary video and you've had a look at the concept map, reading a lot of this stuff should just be clear. You should be able to quickly see the links and understand the ideas, okay? Alright, and you should be able to understand that we are getting a lot of deeper understanding as to why he thought that way. It's becoming a lot clearer, okay? So quickly score yourself on these 3 success criteria, and then again your APK is to still draw this kind of fluctuating bundle of impressions and ideas that creates the illusion of the self. Alrighty, let's get started. This is extract 2, starting from here, okay? It is, again, long, but aren't they all long? Alright, let's zoom in, make it a bit easier for you to read. Okay. Now we proceed to explain the nature of personal identity, which has become so great a question in philosophy, especially of late years in England, where all the abstruser sciences are studied with a peculiar ardour and application. So what he's saying is other sciences, or other ways of looking at the world, tend to be much more strict in terms of their methodology, their method, right? And here it is evidence the same method of reasoning must be continued, which has so successfully explained the identity of plants and animals and ships and houses and all of the compounded and changeable productions either of art or nature. The identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one. Bang! He says it's false. Written down there, you should probably write that down as a quote. Just basically get that down and say, yep, he's right. Yep, understood. Right, so the identity which we ascribe to the mind of man is only a fictitious one, and of a like kind with that which we ascribe to vegetables and animal bodies. And in the other reading video, we kind of said that we know that we're going to get that analogy drawn, okay? And we said that in the summary as well, okay? It cannot, therefore, have a different origin, but must proceed from a like operation of the imagination upon like objects. So we see similar objects, we then tend to have an imagination that uses resemblance links, or uses relationships of resemblance to tie them all together. And because it's much more efficient to assume they have a personal identity, we kind of feign or pretend that the personal identity exists, and then we can easily transition between these relationships of resemblance, okay? And more importantly too, we need to keep in mind that we both understand these two concepts. The concept of sameness can also be disproved and argued as really a kind of erroneous way of thinking about a bunch of related objects that share a similar relationship, okay? And if you get the fact that the two kind of disagree with each other and only one fits with his theory of sense perception and impressions, which is the only accurate point of understanding, then you get why he's saying it is much more accurate to say that we should think about things not as having identity, but instead of having some kind of relation that ties them all together and they are distinct, different perceptions. Okay? But lest this argument should not convince the reader, though my opinion is perfectly decisive, let them weigh the following reasoning, which is still closer and more immediate. 'Tis evident that identity, which we attribute to the human mind, however perfect we may imagine it to be, is not able to run several different perceptions into one. You cannot, and this is something that is not covered in the summary, that you need to write down, right? You cannot imagine many different perceptions happening simultaneously. You are just one at that particular point in time, and that perception could be a perception of an abstract thing like an idea or concept, right? It's not just something that you sense in your environment. That needs to be recorded because that was not covered in the summary, okay? All right, so understand that. You're always going to experience perceptions sequentially, even if you remember them and make copies of them and put them back in your chain of thought. You are essentially going to experience perceptions sequentially. You're never going to experience them at the same time. You're never going to have them concurrently, okay? All right? That's important. The identity which we attribute to the mind. Where do I finish? However imperfect imagined it be, unable to run several different perceptions into one, and make them lose their characters of distinction and difference, which are essential to them. 'Tis still true that every distinct perception which enters into the composition of the mind is a distinct existence, and is different, and is distinguishable, and is separable from every other perception, either contemporary or successive. And we know that. Like, by successive means happening in the past, and contemporary means happening right now, okay? That's all in the summary. But as notwithstanding this distinction and separability, we suppose that the whole train of perceptions, which basically means the kind of constant sequence of perceptions of past or current events happening in our mind, to be united by identity. A question naturally arises concerning this relation of identity, whether it be something that really binds our several perceptions together or only associates their ideas in the imagination. And it's you know that from reading the summary and understanding him, the association of these ideas that have happened sequentially, or more importantly, the association of these perceptions, which generates impressions, which can generate ideas, right, it is basically an association that generates the illusion of self, right, the illusion of sameness, tying them all together, right. That association of this is something I observed then and now is nothing but an association. It doesn't necessarily prove that self exists. That is, in other words, when in pronouncing concerning the identity of a person, we observe some real bond among higher perceptions, or we feel one among these ideas, or we form them. So that is basically saying this feeling is nothing but the association. But the association is an association of me, I observed. However, it's an association. It doesn't prove that the self exists. Okay? Take a note. This question we might easily decide if we would recollect that has been already provided at large, that the understanding never observes any real connection among objects. Understanding can never observe any real connection between objects. Understanding can never, ever observe any connection among real objects. And that's true. I mean, you might see a bat hit a ball, but your understanding can't really go further past that as to why the bat hitting the ball made this particular thing happen. You just have to assume on face value that A causes B. You can't really postulate why A caused B, and if you did, all you're doing is coming up with another cause and effect relationship. You know what I mean? You're not actually getting to another why, a deeper, more profound why. It's just another cause and effect relationship. Okay? Take a note. And that even the union of cause and effect. So cause and effect is really the illusion. Well, how do I put it? No, cause and effect is a relationship. It's not an illusion. You know, we tend to say A causes B, but we can only say it with probability because we can't see every single instance of A and B happening together. That's the problem of induction. So that's why he says now, when strictly examined, resolves itself into a customary association of ideas. Cause and effect is just an association of ideas. If I hit the ball, it will go here. All right. For from thence it evidently follows that identity is nothing really belonging to these different perceptions and uniting them together. So, but it is merely a quality which we attribute to them because of the union of their ideas in the imagination when we reflect upon them. So imagination generates this sense of self, because imagination creates the idea of sameness or cause and effect. But more importantly, it generates the idea of that we use to associate these different perceptions that we have. Okay. Now, the only qualities which can give ideas a union and in the imagination are these three relations above mentioned. That would be contiguity, resemblance, and cause and effect. These are the uniting principles in the ideal world, and by this he doesn't mean perfect, he means world of ideas. All right. And without them, every distinct object is separable by the mind, and may be separable considered, and appears not to have any more connection with any other object than if disjoined by the great difference and remoteness. So what he's saying here, and you should already know this from the summary, is that the relationship of contiguity, which is basically connections between objects, of resemblance, which is basically looking at similarities and differences, and cause and effect, they are nothing but ideas and associations generated by the mind. Okay? And sometimes they can be illusory, sometimes they cannot. But perhaps using self to connect, variable objects that have some kind of similarity with each other is basically using an association to make those connections, but that doesn't mean the association is necessarily correct. All right? Same goes with cause and effect. So, therefore, in some of these relations of resemblance, continuity, and causation that identity depends. And as the very essence of these relations consists in their producing an easy transition of ideas, the reasons why they exist, though they might not be real, these ideas of resemblance, contiguity, and causation is because they just allow us to quickly go through and check different ideas or different impressions or different memories. It follows that our notions of personal identity proceed entirely from a smooth and uninterrupted progress of the thought along the train of connected ideas according to the principles above. So what he's saying is that when you think, you are looking for relationships of resemblance, contiguity, and causation. And you have a train of thought, you have a sequence of ideas constantly being played on that stage that he talks about, and also you have a sequence of memories, and you have a sequence of impressions, right? And to allow you to quickly transition from them, to go from A to B, you use these made-up relationships of resemblance, causation, and contiguity. And that therefore allows you to generate a sense of self, okay? It's easily clear in terms of sameness, because basically, how do I put it? The idea of sameness allows you to say, well, okay, I had that perception, and then I had this perception that happened before. Okay, well, there's something similar about him. I must have been the person that actually observed those two relationships, okay, or those two things. Causation, we should probably get into a bit later. I'm sure he'll elaborate on that, okay? But he's saying in our train of thought, we use those three things in order to connect and transition between ideas, but in doing so, we create the illusion of self. The only question, therefore, which remains is what relations this uninterrupted progress of our thought is produced when we consider the successive existence of the mind or thinking person. And here it is evident that we must confine ourselves to resemblance and causation. Goodbye, contiguity. And we must drop contiguity, which has little or no influence in the present case. To begin with resemblance, supposedly we could see clearly into the breast of another and observe the succession of perceptions which constitutes his mind or thinking principle, and suppose that he always preserves the memory of a considerable part of past perceptions. So we can see him ourselves, remembering his past perceptions, and see what he's actually thinking at this point in time, and what he's perceiving at this point in time. 'Tis evident that nothing could more contribute to the bestowing a relationship on this succession amidst all variations. So it is evident that nothing could more contribute to the bestowing of a relation on this succession amidst all its variations, which is the concept of him. All right, we would agree. We see him. All right, yep, so he must be performing all these things. For what is the memory but a faculty? Okay, so now we take his perspective and we say, okay, well, let's see, he's remembering all these things and he's perceiving these things. So he's saying, what is the memory but a faculty by which we raise up the images of past perceptions? You need to take a note about that, right? Because that really encapsulates his philosophy. He's saying memory is raising up past perceptions. It's understanding how different perceptions happened in different particular times. Okay, take a note. The reason why that is important is because perceptions then in turn generate impressions, which then in turn generate ideas, okay? And ideas really are associations. That's all they are. Let's look at what it basically is, okay? So associations of cause and effect, resemblance and contiguity. And again, this proves that, if you're an empiricist who believes there is a problem of induction, and you're an empiricist who believes that the only thing that's truly reliable is your senses, then everything still is a bunch of random perceptions, okay, or memories or reflections on those perceptions, all right? And as an image necessarily resembles an object, must not the frequent placing of these resembling perceptions in the chain of thought convey the imagination more easily from one link to another and make the whole seem like it's a continuance of one object? Again, you imagine the associations, okay? Or you make the associations, but those associations do allow you to create a sense of self or permanence, because it's just easy to allow you to transition between one perception and another. That should be like a key thing you remember. In this particular, then, the memory not only discovers the identity, but also contributes to its production by producing the relation of resemblance among these perceptions. So memory allows us to, remember we talked about consciousness too, which is the recall of copies of previous perceptions, and memory, which is the faculty which recalls perceptions. So memory allows us to create associations. Associations are links between two different memories. We can't have them. We can't have these memories without the perceptions, all right? So memory allows us to produce resemblance amongst perceptions, because also, when we recall the memories and we see the link, bang, you can't really have that without the memory in the first place. The case is the same whether we consider ourselves or others. All right, just take some notes. As to causation, we may observe that the true idea of the human mind is to consider it as a system of different perceptions or different existences. Right, so we may be recorded instances of our existence at different periods of time, which are linked together by the relation of cause and effect. So we may see what we see in the outside world might be predictable cause and effect relationships, or we might see that our current state of mind in turn will cause another current state of mind. And they mutually produce, destroy, and influence and modify each other. So really, from an objective point of view, we are just the many different entities tied together by the association the mind creates. Our impressions give rise to their correspondent idea, and these ideas in turn produce other impressions. So ideas can make us imagine other impressions, like the unicorn, okay? One thought chases another and draws after a third, by which is expelled in its turn. And in this respect, I cannot compare the soul more properly to anything than to a republic or commonwealth, in which the several members are united by the reciprocal ties of government and subordination, and give rise to other persons who propagate the same republic in the incessant changes of its parts. So the government... Oh boy, it's confusing. Our impressions give rise to their correspondent ideas, and these ideas in turn produce impressions. That makes sense. One thought in turn chases another, and draws after it a third. So it brings one with it another third. by which it is expelled in its turn. So that thought then disappears. And he says this is very similar to what happens in a republic or a commonwealth, in which several members of people, citizens, are united by reciprocal ties of government. So we're saying, okay, it's making sense to me very clearly, but I need to turn this into words. Cause and effect allows us to see how the world is governed. The analogy isn't just what we said here in the Hume summary, okay, which was the governance to citizens as perception is to causation. Causation ends up being like the thing that ties and unites all these different perceptions together to make sense of how the world works. Just like a government does to its citizens, it ties people together and makes the country work, all right? That's the analogy that he's drawing. You need to write that down, okay? Now, of course, because it's so wordy, I'm pretty sure it's going to change in different ways, so let's keep reading. Government to and subordination give rise to other persons who propagate, so basically they have babies and propagate the same republic in incessant changes of parts, so it keeps changing, just like our thoughts. And the same individual republic may not change its members, but also its laws and constitutions, just like we would have a look at cause and effect, right? We know cause and effect and our relationships with cause and effect. The way we see it changes over time. In a like manner, the same person may vary his character and disposition as well as his impressions and ideas without losing his identity. Whatever he changed, so this is basically what the real analogy is. Go back and scrap what I just said. Causation does allow us to tie together many different random perceptions and understand how they work, which is different from resemblance. That is correct. The analogy works in another way, which is that the person is tied together also by impressions and ideas without losing its identity. In like manner, the same person, so a person may vary his character and disposition, so he may change over time, as well as his impressions, so his sense perceptions and ideas without losing his identity. So it's almost like saying the government, what ties together identity, or the illusion of identity would be more accurate, ties together all these different changes in our dispositions, character and perceptions. Take a note. So the two analogies are correct, I might add, okay? One, the analogy that cause and effect allows us to quickly and seemingly tie the world together in a way that is easy to transition from concepts to and from. It's like the government tying together its citizens. But also the analogy works in this way, that the illusion of personhood allows us to tie together many different associations between changes in character, changes in disposition, and changes in perception, all right, and ideas. Take a note. And in this view, our identity with regard to the passions serves to corroborate with regard to the imagination by making our distant perceptions influence each other and by giving us a present concern for our past or future or pains or pleasures. All right, so what he's saying is that the reason why you feel emotions, and there seems to be a cause and effect relationship, is because we seem to create the illusion of self, and that self then has this idea that the way things work is by cause and effect. So it's like cause and effect exists, but also cause and effect is made up, right? And it still exists, but it's made up. And our understanding of cause and effect changes over time, right? And as it does so, that means that the way that we affect our passions and our feelings changes over time, because we imagine that the past is influencing the future, etc. And we're just creating these associations of cause and effect. The best thing to say is that cause and effect is about how event A in the past is affecting event B in the future, but our understanding of cause and effect changes over time. It's not concrete. So as our understanding of cause and effect changes, therefore actually the effects change, and we need to keep that in mind, okay? Take a note. So as memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of succession of perceptions, which it does, we remember things over time and when they happened, to be considered upon that account chiefly as the source of personal identity. So he's saying here, memory is all that is needed, the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions is to be counted upon chiefly as the source of personal identity. How do we know memory? Never should we have any notion of causation, nor consequently the chain of causes and effects which constitutes our self and our perception. Alright. So let's just stop here, record it again. It's really important to know. So we're doubly, triply, absolutely clear that what ties the self together, what allows us to understand how we work and makes us feel a sense of self, is this cause and effect relationship we build within ourselves. If this happens, I usually feel that. Therefore, it happened, I'm going to feel that. That kind of thing. I perceive this. Oh, usually that makes me feel that. That will happen. Those kind of things, okay? So, understand that this idea of causation is really, 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 really important. And again, causation ties our understanding of how the world works together over time and space. But it also allows us to construct a sense of self, because we understand how different parts of ourself cause and affect different other parts of ourselves. This is an illusion, right? And remember, our understanding of cause and effect within ourselves is an illusion. But it is still something that generates the illusion, okay? It makes that illusion seem possible. But having once acquired a notion of causation from memory, we can extend the same chain of causes and consequently the identity of our persons beyond our memory, and we can comprehend times and circumstances and actions which we have entirely forgotten, but suppose in general to have existed. So we know, if we're quite smart, that memory isn't just enough for identity, because we can imagine many different situations which have influenced us now through cause and effect. And as a result, they have in turn shaped us as we are now, even though we can't remember them. So there must be other things besides memory that are needed in order to account for a person. For how few of our past actions are there in which we have any memory? Who can tell me, for instance, that we were his thoughts and actions on the 1st of January 1715, the 11th of March 1979, or the 3rd of August 1733? Or will he affirm, because he has entirely forgot the incidents of these days, that the present self is not the same person with the self of that time, and by that means overturn the most established notions about personal identity? In this view, therefore, memory does not so much produce as discover personal identity. Yep, this is really important. You need to write that down. Again, it's about cause and effect. All right. The reason why it's saying memory does not produce, but it discovers personal identity, and remember, this is where he's saying Locke is wrong, because Locke would say memory produces identity, is because we have an understanding of cause and effect, and we believe too that even though we don't remember things, they had a role in affecting our current state of being, which will in turn create a cause and effect relationship with something else in ourselves. And because we believe that, because we make that association, we believe it, even though it is probably an illusion, memory allows us to discover who we are. But it certainly isn't what produces what we are, because there are things that we've forgotten. Take a note. It will be incumbent upon those who affirm that memory produces entirely our personal identity to give a reason as to why we thus extend our identity beyond memory. And he's saying something's pretty clear here. He's saying, Locke, you got it wrong. The reason why I got it wrong is because we can easily imagine a situation where events that have happened have created our current state, which we can see through imagined cause and effects relationships has an effect on ourselves. And because we understand cause and effect at some level unconsciously, When my child cries, I perceive that. I will feel sad, that kind of thing. And I don't remember why I've evolved these kind of causal understandings of myself, but they're there anyway. There must be something over and above memory, and that's why Locke is wrong. Okay. The whole of this doctrine leads to a conclusion which is of great importance in the present affair, which means namely saying that all the nice and subtle questions concerning personal identity can never possibly be decided. In other words, there's no way we can decide it, and are to be regarded rather as grammatical than philosophical difficulties. Identity depends on the relation of ideas. Identity is really a relational concept. Write that down. Go for it. And those relational ideas are cause and effect that happen inside yourself, things that have caused you to be who you are, and resemblance. Okay? We have no just standard by which we can decide a dispute concerning the time when we acquire or lose a title to that name or identity. All the disputes concerning identity-connected objects are merely verbal, except so far as the relation of parts gives rise to some fiction or imaginary principle of union, as we have already observed. So even though I'm saying identity is nothing but a relational concept, which we tie together through, in this case, relationships of resemblance and cause and effect within self, and cause and effect as an understanding of how I came to be through cause and effect relationships. Resemblance, looking at similarities over past and present, right? They're still fictional, all right? They create the sense of a fictional union, all right? What I have said concerning the first origin and certainty of our notion of identity as supplied to the human mind may be extended with little or no variation to that of simplicity. So in other words, saying things simply exist as one thing over time. An object whose different coexistent parts are bound together by a close relation operates upon the imagination after much the same manner as one perfectly simple and indivisible, and requires not a much greater stretch of thought in order to its conception. From this similarity of operation we attribute a simplicity to it, and feign a principle of union as the support of its simplicity, and the centre of all the different parts and qualities of the object. You get it? You should by now. I don't really need to explain that. If you don't understand it, come and talk to me. Thus, we've finished our examination of several systems of philosophy, both of the intellectual and the moral world. And in our miscellaneous way of reasoning, we have led to several topics which will either illustrate or confirm some preceding part of our discourse, or to prepare the way of our following opinions. 'Tis now time to return to a more close examination of our subject, and proceed in the accurate anatomy of human nature, having fully explained the nature of our judgment and understanding. Alright, that's it. So, okay, really, we did clarify unfamiliar words. We looked at our summary, but we went deeper, okay? And where we went deeper was with causation. I think in the summary, what we managed to do was we managed to really tie resemblance together and say we create associations of resemblance over different periods of time, and most of you could easily say that, we get the fact that we create a sense of identity and unity by looking at relationships of resemblance and similarity, right? And really, the relationship is that the objects are similar, right? Not necessarily that the objects are the same, okay? But we kind of attribute that similarity, we make that similarity seem like it is sameness, just because it allows for a quick transition between similar objects. And we know at some unconscious level, when we actually do the reasoning and the intellectual thinking, that we can define it in such that these are nothing but related, distinguishable objects that occur in sequence. And the self is that, that the illusion of the self is that I had many similarities back when I was 20, but many differences. But I could quite easily trace the relationship because I'm making that association between those similarities and I'm saying sameness. But the real big issue is causation. That's the major one. Because within ourselves we realise that things have caused us to be who we are. things create predictable behaviours in us that create cause, because we've seen these things. We've created a bunch of associations of cause and effect. That's not something that was explained in the summary, and that's something you really need to understand. That it's not just about causality. Causality contributes to the illusion of self, because basically causality allows us to infer why we are now what we are, given this current perception. It creates that kind of illusion, right? It also allows us to, the reason why we need causality is that it allows us to connect many disparate random events together and to make sense of how it works. And in the process of doing so, we have to quickly generate some sense of identity, which is false. But the reason why we do that is because it allows us again to transition between the many different related concepts related by cause and effect. But remember that cause and effect is essential to understanding how we generate an illusion of the self, because we use cause and effect to understand who we are, how we came to be. And it also is essential for him to quickly dismiss Locke, because most people would easily conclude that they can't remember everything, but they understand how certain causes and effects came to contribute how they were to a certain point in time and influence decisions that they would make or things that they can remember. So therefore memory is not enough. Memory just discovers who we are as a person, but it doesn't actually account for or make the person. What makes the person is the associations, the illusions of associations, and our belief too that certain associations contributed to who we were, even though they are just associations of cause and effect that can't be proved. Now that's really deep. You need to record it, okay? And that's the end of our reading.